You feel good?
And remarkably, the answer might actually be yes.
That's the goal. You might want to live long, but even more important, you want to live well. It's so great to talk to people who are doing good work in the world, working on their own happiness and increasing happiness in the world. We really need it right now. So my title is a little bit strange. Who here knows what a telomere is? Raise your hand. Okay, so really I'm going to be, it sounds like I'm not very thematic, the telomere effect, but actually by the end you will see that telomeres are part of how we age. We all have them in every cell, and they care about our happiness. So I will end with showing you the link between our happiness and our communal happiness and our telomeres. So I study aging. I am a personal expert in stress and aging, and so are most of you. So what I realize is that we rarely have time to kind of take a step back from our busy life and take stock. You could call this midlife stock, but I'd like you to just ask yourself these questions. So how long do you want to live? Do you have a number in your head? And why? What's behind that? What do you want to do with the rest of your life? How do you want to spend your time? And with who? And of course, that brings in what's most meaningful to you? What makes you happy? So for me, when I think about this question, I think I want to live as long as I'm well. So it's not really a number. It's really about health span, health and well-being. So here's an example of two people's lives. They die at the same age. They both die at 80. But for one of them, for Jane, she lives for 20 years with disease. So her disease span is very long and her health span is compressed. And for Mary, you can see she has a long health span and disease is compressed to the very end of life. So that's what we all want. That's the goal. You might want to live long, but even more importantly, you want to live well. Because when we get these diseases of aging, dementia, et cetera, there's just inevitable suffering. There's only one way to compress morbidity, to limit disease to the very, very end of life. There's one way, and that is to slow our biological aging. So what is this underlying our chronological age? What is it about biological aging? What regulates the clock on life? So physiology is very complex, but when we look into our cells, there is a phenomenal regulation of the aging of the cell. Some of us age according to the clock, and some of us age more like dog years. So telomeres are just one part of aging. There's a whole complex, there's a whole suite of things happening in our cell that cause aging. Inflammation, mitochondria, epigenetics of the DNA changing. Telomeres is a part of this cluster, and we know a lot about telomeres. And so I'm going to be focusing on them, but as I'm talking about them, I want you to know that most of the ways that we understand aging in the cell, this applies to most of those ways, to inflammation, to mitochondria, et cetera. So these green caps at the ends of our chromosomes are our telomeres. We have these in every single cell in our body. So say hello to your telomeres. If you didn't know about them, now you're not going to forget about them. So these are our genes in the chromosome that make us who we are. That's the code for every cell in our body, for every single protein we make. We want to protect that DNA throughout life. That DNA can get damaged very easily, and that's one way we age. The telomeres are the protective caps for our DNA. And as we age, they shorten. but not at the same rate as time. It's not about the clock, it's about the wear and tear inside our cell, the wear and tear that we can control in our body. So aging is much more malleable and under our control than we have thought. So here you can see these short telomeres. When they get too short, what happens is that two things. That cell either dies or that cell becomes an old age cell, we call a senescent cell, and changes all the programming, so now it's creating pro-inflammatory cytokines and causing inflammation, the inflammation to rise slowly in our blood. We need long telomeres so that our cells can keep replenishing. So the type of aging I'm talking about is the science of renewal. It's how all the cells in our mitotic cells in our brain, in our blood, our cardiovascular lining, our bone, we have these cells that replenish across our lifespan and refresh, and so that we have new cells, and that's how we can live well to 100. So we want to protect our telomeres. Telomeres and telomerase, the enzyme that protects them, were discovered almost 30 years ago by Elizabeth Blackburn and her colleagues. Elizabeth is the first woman from Australia to win the Nobel Prize. And not the last. Who's next? So Elizabeth discovered these in a single-celled organism, this tetrahymena, and she and her graduate student, Carol Greider, could tell that the telomeres were very important and were somehow controlling the lifespan of the cell. So then they discovered the enzyme telomerase that protects the telomeres, and then they manipulated life. When they cut down telomerase and cut it out of the cell, this organism died. When they extended the telomerase, filled up that cell with telomerase, this organism became immortal. So for many years, the question was, does that have anything to do with human biology? And the answer is very much so. We now know from decades of research that the length of our telomeres at midlife in our blood, the average length of our telomeres, predicts early aging, diseases of aging, heart disease, diabetes, dementia, and certain types of cancer. So what I want to talk about are some levers that control the rate of our telomere attrition or our telomere aging. So I'll briefly take us through the three topics. One is suffering, stress and depression. We know a lot about that. We know a little bit less about happiness. But it turns out relationships and our social world are very important to our telomeres. And then lastly, we're going to talk about daily habits. I'm sorry, but they do matter. And we will revisit some of what you know, and you may feel even more motivated to be small daily habits build up to predict longer telomeres later in life. Okay, so about 16 years ago, Elizabeth Blackburn and I started our first study, and we wanted to just ask the question, are people under chronic stress having more wear and tear and shorter telomeres? And what we found was that parents of children with chronic conditions had significantly shorter telomeres, lower levels of the enzyme telomerase, and more oxidative stress. But actually, it wasn't just about being a caregiver. It was actually about the perception of stress, how they felt. And that applied to our control group, too, parents of neurotypical children. So really, more and more, the story of suffering and the story of happiness is partly in our perspective and what we make of what's in front of us, what we expect, what we predict. So we now know, 15 years later, that many, many types of deep suffering, toxic stress that goes on for years and years, is associated with accelerated cell aging. Early child adversity, abuse, neglect, depression. Actually, every psychiatric disorder is associated with shorter telomeres. These are associations. We think that they're partly causal, they're complex. What about work stress? If typical work stress was associated with shorter telomeres, I think we'd all be dying decades earlier. And so the good news is that So far, work stress is not related to telomere attrition, but burnout is. And I'll be talking more about that at the Workplace Wellness Summit this afternoon. So really, it's our response to chronic stress that is a big predictor. What's the mediator? What is it in our body that causes psychological distress to accelerate the aging of our cells? We have hints from both animal and human studies that it's the set of biological factors we call allostatic load. Things like insulin resistance, stress hormones, poor mitochondria function, and an overly vigilant autonomic nervous system. So depression and stress and telomeres, we call it kind of a triad. We know that chronic stress can cause depressive symptoms and depression for people who are vulnerable, and that telomere shortening is associated with both chronic stress and depression, especially depression. I want to point out two other ways we age, mitochondria and systemic inflammation. So we think of these as ways that our cells age when we look inside and we can measure these. Recently, we finished the first study looking at mitochondrial health and well-being. We measured mood every day when people woke up, when they went to bed, and we did this in caregivers and controls. And no one has ever looked at stress and mitochondria in humans. And let me tell you what we found. The caregivers had dampened mitochondria function. Their mitochondria, for the most stressed caregivers, looked like they had a mitochondrial disorder. This is work with Martin Picard at Columbia. But then we want to know, well, what is it about being a caregiver? Can we look into the day and find out who's doing well and who's suffering in terms of their mitochondria? Because that's what we can change. That's what we can target. That's what matters. It's not inevitable if you're a caregiver that you develop this accelerated cell aging. So we looked at daily mood, and what we found is that our mitochondria appear sensitive to our daily mood. So the yellow bars are feeling positive happiness. The more people felt happiness when they woke up and when they went to bed, these bookends, the healthier their mitochondria were. The mitochondria are our energy, our battery in each cell. They create energy. They make us feel vitality. And then the opposite, more negative mood, the black bar, lowest mitochondrial function. So take home from this is how we start our day and how we end our day really matter in terms of mood. What's an instant boost to our positive affect? So you'll probably hear about many different options today, but I want to just point out that gratitude, waking up and thinking of something you're grateful for, has been shown to increase positive mood. It's not a hard one. It's not a big skill you need to teach. Another thing is waking up and thinking of something you're looking forward to that day. And that's also related to purpose in life, waking up and feeling a sense of purpose in your day, in your work. Okay, so this is all a little bit of doom and gloom, the dark side of stress and chronic stress, with a little bit of light from mood, if we can improve our mood. But I do want to point out that there is a positive side of stress, and I don't have time to go into it very much. But we call this, really it's more short-term stress, or how we respond to a stressor. And all of us have or will face tragedy and trauma. And some of my favorite quotes are really kind of pointing out this is to be expected rather than rejected, that this is part of life. And this also has a silver lining. Not that we want to face trauma and stressors. So these are two of my favorite quotes. Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. My son's favorite author, one of mine too, J.K. Rowling. And the other, out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls, the most massive characters are seared with scars. So I think it's important to remember that when we talk to people about their life experience and how that shaped them. So what is this positive stress response? Now I'm going to go back to this acute response. So lion and gazelle are both having an acute physical response, but is it the same? Lion's about to get the meal. She is looking forward to it. She's excited. Her heart is pumping ferocious amounts of blood. Gazelle is having a different response. Threat for her life. Her heart is not pumping so much blood. Her blood pressure goes up the same as lion's, but it's through vasoconstriction. She's having a threat response. So we know there's a very different response when we feel positive opportunity for gain, reaching a goal, versus feeling our ego or our survival is threatened. So there's a lot of biology that's different. There's a lot of psychology that goes with that. We've been studying that. So in the lab, for example, when we stress people out, we measure this positive versus negative feelings and thoughts. And what we have found in several studies is that when people have more of a positive challenge orientation, hopeful, enthusiastic, excited, they have a healthier acute stress response. And they tend to have longer telomeres. I'm going to leave you with a statement to say to yourself next time you're facing a really stressful talk or something stressful and you know you're going to face something. I want you to say to yourself, as you notice your body starting to have that stress response, your heart starting to race, tell yourself, this is exciting. This is positive stress, because your appraisal of it, the way you're thinking about it, is going to shape your physiological response. And there have been great studies on this, in part by my colleague Wendy Mendez at UCSF. She's trained people to approach stress like that. They do better on exams. Okay, so enough about stress. It's not all bad. I want to talk about love, relationships. We know a tremendous amount about longevity and relationships. Telomeres appear to be associated with things like how much support we feel, how much social support in older people, how long we've been married, and couples who have been married, their telomeres are actually correlated. So when we look at newlywed couples, their telomeres are not very correlated. And when we look at older couples, that relationship is significantly stronger. We age together. So, what else do we know about relationships? They predict longevity, healthy longevity. They predict positive partner relationships, predict a healthier stress response. And what I like to say is, we are socially permeable. So we feel like we're just separated by our skin and we have our own stress responses, but actually we influence each other's stress responses. We have emotional contagion, whether we're aware of it or not. We're affected by people at work, by people in our home. And so that's good news. That means that we can actually harness that for good and create a positive affect in our own microcosm. What about sex? No one thought I was going to talk about sex, but we do have one study where we happened to be measuring people's sleep, and we had to know how often they had sexual intimacy, because that's a confound. That would interfere with our measures. And then we just decided a few years ago to analyze that data, and we found that couples who were more sexually intimate had longer telomeres, both the men and the women. It's a really simple study. It's just correlational, but it went more viral globally than any other study we published. Okay, now down to habits. There have been many cross-sectional studies here, so I don't want to give you the sense that this is a done story and it's causal and there's all sorts of experiments, because it's hard to manipulate health behaviors in humans. But we know from many population-based studies that good quality sleep versus being sedentary is associated with longer telomeres. Duration, too. You already knew about duration, but quality, think about that. How can you influence the quality of your sleep? Well, it reflects what you did before sleep. Your day, your evening. Have you wound down? Have you exercised, etc.? Being sedentary is associated with shorter telomeres, and being physically active is associated with long telomeres. In many, many countries by now, we found this. Meditation, I'll talk about in a minute. What about diet? Really, really solid story is about vegetables and fruit. The rainbow of colors in our diet is associated with longer telomeres. Eli Putterman, one of my colleagues, did a trial. There's starting to be more trials, experiments, so that we can know, can we change our telomeres? Is this a causal relationship? So we took stressed dementia caregivers and had them trained in being physically active for 6 months. They were walking or being on a treadmill, et cetera. And what he found was at the end of 6 months, the control group had no change in telomeres, but those who exercised actually had lengthening. So this is really exciting and hopeful that we can actually not just protect our telomeres, but possibly even lengthen them. Now back to diet. I just need to tell you about this because I feel like it's not interesting enough for businesses. There's no commercial interest behind diet, so we don't hear about this. But the rainbow of fruits and vegetables is related to longevity in a dose-response way, as well as to longer telomeres. That's one of the mechanisms. This is an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory diet. That's what these foods do in our body, and that's partly why they're anti-aging. Well, it turns out that this same diet, the Mediterranean diet, whole food diet, is associated with lower anxiety, lower depression, lower stress. The American diet, I'll just say the Western junk food diet, is associated with more depression in many large population-based studies. I've been in this field a long time, and this is not something people talk about. And so then the question is, of course, can we manipulate diet and treat depression? There's been one amazing trial showing that if you take people with major depression and you have them eat a Mediterranean diet, there is 30% remission from depression. Now that's remarkable. We don't get that with drugs, with our antidepressants. So food is affecting our mood, our stress, our cell aging, and it's up to us. Which rainbow are you going to choose? And this is tricky, right? Because when we're stressed and depressed, we're driven to choose the donuts. Our brain craves the sugar. So just think of your telomeres when you have the choice. Okay, so let's talk about meditation, a common interest here. We've been very interested in meditation. There have been many trials by now on different types of mind-body activities, Qigong, TM meditation, yogic meditation, Vipassana or mindfulness meditation. And the trials look very positive. We recently published a 3-week residential retreat. It was a month-long retreat, and we looked at telomeres before and after 3 weeks. It made it what we found was that telomeres lengthened. It was a small study. I never call these definitive, but there's just suggestion that what we do in the short term can really improve our cell aging. Why do all these mind-body activities help so much? Well, particularly for mindfulness meditation, that really trains us to observe our thoughts, trains us in metacognition. We're changing our relationship to our thoughts. We may never get rid of our self-critic, our inner critic. We may never get rid of a ruminative style. But if we're noticing it and aware of it, we can take away its power. We can look at thoughts just as thoughts, not as reality. And our body's not going to be stressed out by them. This was just published this month by my colleague Barbara Fredrickson. She trained people in mindfulness meditation and loving-kindness meditation, teaching people to feel self-compassion, compassion for others. And what she found was that the telomeres in the loving-kindness meditation at the end did not shorten over that period of study, whereas in the other groups, the control group and the mindfulness group, they did. So there's suggestion that type of meditation matters, but right now we don't have much granularity on that. Purpose in life, I'm bringing up because we know in population-based studies that it predicts longevity. In one of our meditation studies with Cliff Sarin, people who were on a retreat increased in their purpose in life in different amounts. And those who increased the most had the biggest boost in telomerase, the anti-aging enzyme telomerase. So again, that brings us back to, what did you say to yourself when you woke up today? What thoughts did you have? What did you look forward to? What is meaningful to you? This is my website. We just put a quiz up on purpose in life, and you can see it really is about, on a daily basis, how much purpose and meaning do you have? What are your goals? So really we have these two driving forces, love and fear. We're motivated to seek safety and connection and avoid fear and anxiety. And these basic drives that really determine a lot of our actions in our life are also regulating our cell aging. We're wired that way so that our cells are, in a sense, listening to our thoughts and emotions. So just to summarize, how does life experience shape cell aging? Those daily habits, small positive habits, really make a difference. Threat, stress, trauma, having a vigilant nervous system. Yes, happens to all of us, but we need to keep that in check and be countering that with positive strategies, with support, with changing situations that we can change. And presence, I haven't talked about it, but we've also studied mind wandering versus presence. Presence, positive relationships versus conflictual relationships, and purpose in life are all these positive forces that can help us counter the natural anxiety and threat that we're wired to have. So I'd just like to end with, again, you asking yourself, what makes you happy? And because we're focusing on happiness for 2 days, I'll just point out there's pleasure, there's hedonic happiness from short-term things like those donuts. And then there's eudaimonic happiness, which we may not even notice because it's not a exciting, aroused state that we notice in our body, but it's that calm content from doing good, from being with people, from feeling love. So how do you want to spend the rest of your days? Your telomeres are noticing. Your happiness is connected to your cell aging and our cell aging together.